The dismissive avoidance relationship with the person who truly loved them is paradoxical and painful. The very person who saw past their defenses, who loved them despite their patterns, who showed patience and understanding while they struggled with intimacy, often becomes the target of their most intense negative feelings. This isn't hate in the simple sense of disliking someone. It's a complex psychological response where the avoidant experiences profound discomfort, resentment, and even contempt toward the person who loved them most authentically, most completely, most unconditionally. This response seems irrational. Why would someone hate the person who treated them best, who accepted them most fully, who loved them through their worst behavior? But the hatred emerges precisely because this person's love created conditions the avoidant's psychological defenses were built to prevent: being truly known, being vulnerable, being dependent on someone whose presence matters profoundly. The person who truly loved the avoidant didn't just see the curated version they present to the world. They saw the wounds, the fears, the desperate need for connection beneath the independence. And this level of being seen, while it's what the avoidant secretly craves, is also what terrifies them most. The hatred that emerges isn't really about the person who loved them. It's about what that person's love revealed about the avoidant themselves, about their own needs and dependencies they've spent a lifetime denying, about their own vulnerability they've worked so hard to hide. Understanding why dismissive avoidants hate the one person who truly loved them reveals the tragedy at the heart of their attachment pattern, that they destroy the very thing they need most, because needing anything at all feels intolerable. The discomfort of being truly seen and accepted. The first reason dismissive avoidants develop negative feelings toward the person who truly loved them is the profound discomfort of being truly seen and accepted, of having someone know them completely, their fears, their wounds, their patterns, their authentic self beneath the defense of independence, and loving them anyway. This level of being known contradicts the avoidant's core defensive strategy, which relies on keeping people at enough distance that they never fully see the avoidant's vulnerability, never fully understand the depth of their need for connection, never penetrate the facade of complete self-sufficiency. When someone sees through this facade and loves what they find underneath, it creates existential discomfort for the avoidant that can curdle into something resembling hatred. The discomfort begins with the recognition that someone knows them fully. The dismissive avoidant has spent their life carefully managing what others see, presenting a curated version that emphasizes strength, independence, lack of need. But the person who truly loved them saw past this presentation. They saw the moments when the avoidant was scared, lonely, needing comfort, but unable to ask for it. They recognized the withdrawal as fear rather than as preference for solitude. They understood the emotional unavailability as protection rather than as lack of feeling. This complete seeing strips the avoidant of their primary defense, the ability to hide their vulnerability behind independence. Being fully known feels like being naked, exposed, without the protective covering that's made them feel safe. The acceptance that accompanies this seeing is equally uncomfortable. The avoidant could manage being known if it came with judgment, with disappointment, with eventual abandonment. These responses would confirm their belief that their authentic self is unlovable, that their needs are too much, that their patterns make them unworthy of sustained love. But when someone sees them completely and loves them anyway, when someone accepts their patterns while also maintaining their own boundaries, when someone loves the real avoidant rather than the performance, it contradicts the avoidant's core belief system. This contradiction creates cognitive dissonance that's deeply uncomfortable. If someone can see them fully and still love them, then maybe their entire defensive structure is unnecessary. Maybe their independence is defense rather than authentic preference. Maybe They've been protecting themselves from something that isn't actually as dangerous as they believed. The discomfort of being seen and accepted also includes the vulnerability of mattering to someone. When someone truly loves the avoidant becomes important to that person in ways the avoidant can't control or minimize. Their presence or absence affects someone else. Their behavior has impact that's felt and expressed. Their choices matter to someone beyond themselves. This mattering is uncomfortable because it creates a form of obligation and responsibility. The avoidant can't simply do whatever they want without considering how it affects someone who genuinely cares about them. The freedom the avoidant prizes is complicated by someone else's feelings, and this complication feels like the loss of autonomy the avoidant fears. Being truly seen and accepted also means the avoidant can't hide behind their narratives about why relationships don't work. They can't claim people are too demanding when someone loves them while maintaining boundaries. They can't suggest partners are too needy when someone loves them while maintaining their own full life. They can't insist they're incompatible with intimacy when someone has achieved intimacy with them despite their defenses. The person who truly loved them serves as living proof that the problem isn't that the avoidant needs to find the right person. The problem is the avoidant's own fear of sustained closeness. This exposure of their narratives as defensive rather than as accurate assessment of reality is profoundly uncomfortable. The discomfort also includes the avoidant recognizing their own attachment and dependency on the person who loves them. When someone truly loves you and you allow them close enough to matter, you become attached whether you want to or not. The avoidant finds themselves thinking about this person, missing them when they're apart, wanting to share experiences with them, feeling better in their presence. These experiences of attachment and dependency are exactly what the avoidant has organized their life to avoid, because dependency means vulnerability to loss. But being truly loved creates conditions where attachment happens almost involuntarily, and the avoidant resents the person who created these conditions, who made them feel needs they don't want to feel, who became important enough that losing them would hurt. The discomfort of being seen and accepted curdles into something resembling hatred, because the avoidant doesn't have emotional space for the complexity of simultaneous comfort and discomfort, of wanting closeness while fearing it, of appreciating being loved while resenting the vulnerability it creates. Instead of holding this complexity, the avoidant simplifies. They focus on the discomfort and blame the person who created it. The person who truly loved them becomes the enemy because they made the avoidant feel vulnerable, because they penetrated defenses that are supposed to be impenetrable, because they made the avoidant matter to someone and made themselves matter to the avoidant in ways that feel dangerous. The hatred isn't really about the person. It's about what the person's love revealed about the avoidant's own needs and vulnerabilities that they've spent their life denying. The resentment towards someone who exposed their vulnerability. The second reason dismissive avoidants develop negative feelings toward the person who truly loved them is resentment about having their vulnerability exposed, about being in a position where someone saw them weak or needing or emotionally dependent, about having moments where their defenses failed and someone witnessed the fear and need beneath the independence. The dismissive avoidance identity is built on not being vulnerable, on not needing people, on being the strong one who doesn't break down or require support. When someone loves them deeply enough and stays present long enough, they inevitably see moments when this identity fails, when the avoidant is vulnerable, despite their best efforts to remain defended, and the avoidant resents the witness to their vulnerability, resents the person who saw them in states they didn't want to be seen in. The resentment emerges from specific moments when the avoidant's vulnerability was exposed. Maybe they broke down crying during difficulty, and the person who loved them was there witnessing it. Maybe they expressed fear or need in a moment of crisis before they could stop themselves. Maybe they were sick or injured and required care they couldn't provide for themselves. Maybe they experienced loss and couldn't maintain their stoic independence. In these moments, the person who truly loved them saw the avoidant as vulnerable, needy, not entirely self-sufficient. And while the person who loved them likely responded with compassion and care, the avoidant experiences shame about having been seen this way. The shame transforms into resentment toward the person who witnessed their vulnerability. The resentment also stems from the avoidant's recognition that this person has power over them through having seen their vulnerability. Vulnerability is power in relationships. When someone knows your fears and wounds, when they've seen you at your weakest, they have information about you that could be used to hurt you. The dismissive avoidant, whose entire strategy is about preventing anyone from having this kind of power, resents that the person who loved them possesses this knowledge, that they could use it against them, that they're now in a position of potential exposure. Even if the person never uses this knowledge manipulatively, the mere fact that they possess it creates resentment in the avoidant who feels they've given away too much, shown too much, allowed someone too far in. The resentment towards someone who exposed their vulnerability also includes anger at themselves for having been vulnerable, anger that gets displaced onto the person who witnessed it. The avoidant is furious with themselves for breaking down, for needing someone, for showing weakness. But self-directed anger is uncomfortable and doesn't resolve anything, so it gets redirected toward the person who was present during the vulnerability. The avoidant blames them for having seen too much, for having been there during moments when the avoidant's guard was down, for having drawn out vulnerability through their persistent love and presence. It's not rational. The person who loved them didn't create the avoidant's vulnerability. They just witnessed it. But the avoidant's shame about their own vulnerability needs a target, and the person who loved them becomes that target. The resentment also emerges from the avoidant's fear that the person who witnessed their vulnerability now sees them as weak, as needy, as less than the independent persona they work to maintain. Even if the person who loved them never expressed anything but acceptance and compassion, the avoidant projects their own judgment of vulnerability as weakness onto the other person. They assume the person now sees them as pathetic, as desperate, as the kind of person the avoidant despises, someone who needs others. This assumed judgment creates resentment because the avoidant hates being seen the way they fear they're being seen, and they resent the person they believe is judging them this way, even when that person isn't actually judging them at all. The resentment towards someone who exposed their vulnerability includes the avoidant's discomfort with the intimacy that vulnerability creates. Shared vulnerability is the foundation of genuine intimacy. When someone sees you at your most exposed and responds with care rather than judgment, it creates deep connection. But the dismissive avoidant doesn't want deep connection, or rather, they want it and fear it simultaneously. The intimacy that emerges from shared vulnerability feels too close, too binding, too much like the kind of dependency they've organized their life to avoid. They resent the person who created this intimacy through their response to the avoidant's vulnerability, who made the relationship deeper and more meaningful through their compassionate witness, who transformed moments of weakness into foundations of connection. The resentment also stems from the avoidant's recognition that they owe something to the person who saw their vulnerability and didn't weaponize it, who cared for them during moments when they couldn't care for themselves, who maintained their dignity when they felt they'd lost it. This sense of debt is uncomfortable for the dismissive avoidant who doesn't want to owe anyone anything, who values independence, partly because it means not being indebted or obligated. The person who loved them through their vulnerable moments has given them something: care, compassion, witness without judgment, and the avoidant resents both the debt this creates and the person who created it by being decent enough to care for them when they were exposed. The resentment towards someone who exposed their vulnerability ultimately reveals how deeply the dismissive avoidant fears their own humanness, their own need, their own inability to be entirely self-sufficient. The person who truly loved them became a mirror, reflecting back the vulnerability the avoidant works so hard to deny, and the avoidant smashes the mirror rather than accepting what it shows. The hatred isn't about what the person did. They responded to vulnerability with love. The hatred is about the avoidant's inability to accept that they are vulnerable, that they do need people, that their independence is performance rather than essence. And rather than confronting this truth about themselves, they direct their discomfort and shame toward the person who made them see it, resenting the witness to their humanity, as though that witness created the vulnerability, rather than simply being present for it, with the kind of love the avoidant needed, but couldn't accept. The contempt for the person who tolerated their worst behavior. The third reason dismissive avoidants develop negative feelings toward the person who truly loved them is contempt for someone who tolerated their worst behavior without leaving, who accepted treatment that shouldn't have been acceptable, who stayed through patterns that should have been deal breakers. This contempt is paradoxical and cruel. The very patience and tolerance that allowed the relationship to continue, despite the avoidance patterns, becomes something the avoidant despises rather than appreciates. The person who loved them showed extraordinary patience, gave countless chances, accepted breadcrumbs as though they were sufficient, waded through withdrawal after withdrawal, and rather than feeling grateful for this tolerance, the dismissive avoidant feels contempt because someone who accepts poor treatment must not value themselves, must be weak, must be desperate in ways the avoidant finds pathetic. The contempt begins with the avoidant's recognition that the person who loved them accepted behavior the avoidant knows was unacceptable. The avoidant withdrew without communication repeatedly. They canceled plans. They were emotionally unavailable. They kept the person at distance while maintaining other options. They gave minimal effort while receiving maximum patience. The avoidant knows on some level that this behavior wasn't okay, that most people with self-respect wouldn't have tolerated it, that they were treating someone poorly who deserved better. But instead of feeling guilt or remorse about this mistreatment, the avoidant feels contempt for the person who accepted it. If they had any self-worth, the avoidant reasons, they would have left. Their willingness to stay reveals weakness that the avoidant finds disgusting. The contempt also emerges from the avoidant's belief that people should be strong, independent, capable of walking away from relationships that don't serve them. The dismissive avoidant values these qualities, or believes they value them, and when someone demonstrates the opposite by staying through patterns that violate their needs, the avoidant loses respect for them. The person who loved them showed the opposite of what the avoidant claims to value. They showed dependency rather than independence. They showed patience rather than boundaries. They showed hope rather than pragmatic assessment of reality. This demonstration of qualities the avoidant associates with weakness creates contempt that overshadows any appreciation for the love behind the patience. The contempt for tolerance also includes the avoidant's discomfort with having power over someone. When someone tolerates your worst behavior, when they accept treatment that hurts them, when they stay, despite having every reason to leave, it reveals that you have significant power over them, the power to hurt them and know they'll stay, the power to mistreat them without consequence, the power that comes from being more important to them than they are to themselves. This power is uncomfortable for the avoidant because it makes explicit the other person's dependency and need, and it creates responsibility the avoidant doesn't want. Rather than using their power compassionately or recognizing it as reason to treat the person better, the avoidant resents the person for giving them this power through their tolerance. The avoidant blames the person for making themselves vulnerable to mistreatment rather than examining their own choice to mistreat someone who loved them. The contempt also stems from the avoidant's projection of their own self-judgment onto the person who tolerated their behavior. The avoidant judges themselves harshly for having any needs, for any moments of weakness, for any dependency. When they see someone else demonstrating extreme need and dependency by staying through their mistreatment, the avoidant projects their own self-contempt onto that person. They hate in the other person what they hate in themselves: the need for connection, the inability to walk away, the hope that love will be reciprocated. The person who loved them becomes a screen onto which the avoidant projects all their own self-loathing about their own needs and vulnerabilities that they work so hard to deny. The contempt for someone who tolerated their worst behavior also includes the avoidant's belief that if they were in the other person's position, they would have left, that they would never accept such treatment, that they have more self-respect than to tolerate what the person who loved them tolerated. This belief is partially defensive and partially accurate. The avoidant would leave because they're hypervigilant to any sign that they're being mistreated or controlled, because they value independence over connection, because they'd rather be alone than in a relationship that requires them to tolerate discomfort. But the comparison serves to make the avoidant feel superior to the person who loved them, to create a hierarchy where the avoidant's willingness to leave quickly is strength, and the other person's willingness to stay is weakness. The contempt also emerges from the avoidant's unconscious recognition that the person who tolerated their behavior enabled them to continue patterns they perhaps should have been forced to confront sooner. If the person who loved them had established firm boundaries, had left when mistreated, had required better behavior, the avoidant might have been forced to examine their patterns and do work on themselves earlier. But the person's tolerance allowed the avoidant to continue their dysfunction without consequence, and the avoidant resents them for this enabling, even though the avoidant was the one benefiting from it, and would have resented boundary setting just as much or more. The contempt reflects the avoidant's frustration with themselves for not being better, projected onto the person who loved them for not requiring them to be better. The contempt for the person who tolerated their worst behavior reveals one of the cruelest paradoxes of dismissive, avoidant attachment. They need someone patient enough to tolerate their patterns while they work through their fear of intimacy, but they lose respect for anyone who provides that patience. They need someone who won't abandon them during their withdrawal, but they despise anyone who stays. They need unconditional love to feel safe enough to be vulnerable, but they feel contempt for anyone who loves them unconditionally, rather than demanding better treatment. The person who truly loved them couldn't win. If they left, the avoidant would have seen it as confirmation that people always leave, that dependency is dangerous. But by staying, they earned the avoidant's contempt for being weak enough to accept mistreatment. The hatred the avoidant feels toward the person who loved them isn't about what that person did wrong. It's about the impossible position the avoidant's own wounds create, where love is simultaneously needed and despised, where patience is required and contemned, where staying proves weakness and leaving proves people can't be trusted. The projection of self-hatred onto the one who loved them. The fourth reason dismissive avoidants develop negative feelings toward the person who truly loved them is that they project their own self-hatred, their own shame about their needs and limitations, their own disgust with their vulnerability onto the person who witnessed and accepted those aspects of themselves. The dismissive avoidant carries profound self-contempt beneath their facade of confidence and independence, contempt for their own needs, shame about their attachment wounds, disgust with any moments when they weren't entirely self-sufficient, When someone loves them fully, that person becomes associated with the parts of themselves the avoidant hates most. The person who loved them saw the needy parts, the wounded parts, the parts that want connection desperately while fearing it. And the avoidant, unable to accept these parts of themselves, redirects their self-hatred toward the person who saw these parts and loved them anyway. The projection begins with the avoidant's deep shame about having attachment needs at all. The dismissive avoidant has learned that needs are weakness, that wanting connection is pathetic, that depending on anyone makes them vulnerable in intolerable ways. They've built their entire identity around not needing people, around being complete alone, around independence as the highest value. But with the person who truly loved them, their attachment needs became visible. They wanted this person's presence. They missed them when apart. They felt better when connected. These experiences of need conflict with the avoidant self-concept, creating shame about having needs they're not supposed to have. Rather than accepting that needs are human and normal, the avoidant projects their shame onto the person who activated these needs, blaming them for making them feel dependent, hating them for drawing out the neediness the avoidant despises in themselves. The projection also includes the avoidant's self-hatred about their limitations and failures in relationship. The dismissive avoidant knows on some level that their patterns hurt people, that their withdrawal creates pain, that their inability to sustain intimacy makes them insufficient as partners. But acknowledging this directly would require confronting their limitations and working to change them, which feels overwhelmingly difficult. Instead, the avoidant projects their self-judgment about being a bad partner onto the person who loved them. They find fault with that person, criticizing them for being too needy, too demanding, too emotional, as a way of deflecting from their own inadequacy. The person who loved them becomes the repository for all the avoidant self-criticism, allowing the avoidant to maintain their self-image by externalizing everything they dislike about themselves onto their partner. The projection of self-hatred also manifests as the avoidant blaming the person who loved them for making them feel guilty. The avoidant knows their behavior causes hurt. They see the pain in their partner's face when they withdraw. They recognize the damage their inconsistency creates. They understand on some level that they're failing to meet reasonable relationship expectations. This recognition creates guilt that's uncomfortable and challenges the avoidant's self-concept as someone whose behavior is justified and reasonable. Rather than sitting with the guilt and allowing it to motivate change, the avoidant projects blame onto their partner. You make me feel guilty for needing space, or you make me feel bad about myself. The person who loved them becomes responsible for the avoidant's guilt, rather than the avoidant taking responsibility for behavior that warrants guilt. The projection also includes the avoidant attributing to their partner feelings and judgments that actually originate in the avoidant themselves. The avoidant thinks they're pathetic for having needs, so they assume their partner thinks they're pathetic. The avoidant judges themselves for moments of vulnerability, so they assume their partner judges them. The avoidant has contempt for their own emotional dependency, so they assume their partner has contempt for them. These projections aren't based on the partner's actual feelings or behavior. They're the avoidant's own self-hatred projected outward and attributed to the person who loved them, creating a false narrative where the partner is judging and condemning them, when actually, the partner is accepting and loving them. The projection of self-hatred also manifests in how the avoidant interprets their partner's love and acceptance. When someone loves the dismissive avoidant fully, the avoidant can't accept it at face value because they don't believe they're lovable, don't believe anyone could truly accept them if they really knew them. So the avoidant reinterprets the partner's love as something else, as neediness, as dependency, as the partner settling because they can't do better, as manipulation designed to trap them. These reinterpretations allow the avoidant to reject the love without having to accept that they're rejecting genuine care and acceptance. The avoidant projects their own inability to love onto the person who loved them, assuming the partner's love is contaminated by the same wounds and limitations the avoidant carries. The projection also includes the avoidant making their partner responsible for the avoidant's emotional state in ways that deflect from the avoidant's own responsibility for their feelings. When the avoidant feels suffocated, they blame the partner for being too clingy, rather than examining their own fear of closeness. When the avoidant feels guilty, they blame the partner for making them feel guilty, rather than recognizing their behavior warrants guilt. When the avoidant feels anxious about intimacy, they blame the partner for moving too fast, rather than acknowledging their own discomfort with normal relationship progression. Every uncomfortable feeling the avoidant experiences gets projected onto the partner, as though the partner created the feeling, rather than the feeling emerging from the avoidant's own wounds and fears. The projection of self-hatred onto the person who truly loved them is perhaps the most tragic aspect of how dismissive avoidants develop hatred towards someone who offered genuine love. The person who loved them becomes a screen onto which the avoidant projects all their own self-loathing, all their shame about having needs, all their contempt for vulnerability, all their judgment about not being perfect and self-sufficient. The hatred the avoidant directs toward this person is actually self-hatred that's too painful to own, redirected towards someone who made the mistake of loving them fully, enough that they became associated with all the parts of the avoidant that the avoidant can't accept. The person who loved them didn't create these feelings in the avoidant. These feelings existed long before the relationship. But by loving the avoidant, by seeing them fully, by accepting them completely, they became the target for feelings that have nowhere else to go, in someone who can't tolerate their own human limitations and needs. The tragic recognition of what they destroyed through their hatred. The fifth and final aspect of how dismissive avoidants hate the person who truly loved them is the eventual tragic recognition, which comes for some avoidants but not all, of what they destroyed through their hatred, contempt, and rejection of someone who offered genuine love. This recognition typically arrives too late to save the relationship, after the person who loved them has finally left or moved on, after the avoidant has pushed away something irreplaceable through their inability to tolerate being loved. The recognition is tragic because it forces the avoidant to confront that they're architects of their own isolation, that they destroyed connection they actually needed, that their defensive hatred protected them from vulnerability, while simultaneously ensuring they'd never experience the security and fulfillment genuine love provides. The tragic recognition often begins when the avoidant loses access to the person who loved them, not temporarily through their usual withdrawal patterns, but permanently through the other person's genuine moving on. The avoidant realizes the person isn't waiting anymore, isn't available for their return, has built a life that doesn't include space for them. This permanent loss feels different from the managed distance the avoidant is comfortable with. It's actual loss rather than controlled separation, and it triggers grief and recognition that might not have emerged while the person was still pursuing or available. The avoidant confronts that they had something valuable, and they destroyed it not through circumstance or bad luck, but through their own patterns, their own fear, their own hatred of being loved fully. The recognition includes the avoidant seeing clearly, for perhaps the first time, how rare it is to find someone who loves you fully despite your limitations, who sees your wounds and stays anyway, who offers patience and understanding while maintaining their own worth. The avoidant realizes that most people won't tolerate what this person tolerated, won't be patient enough to wait, while the avoidant works through their fear, won't see past their defenses to recognize the person underneath. The person who loved them wasn't average or easily replaced. They were exceptional in their capacity for love, exceptional in their willingness to see the avoidant clearly and still choose them, exceptional in their patience. And the avoidant destroyed this exceptional connection through contempt and hatred born from their own inability to accept love. The tragic recognition also involves the avoidant understanding that their hatred wasn't really about the person at all. It was about their own wounds, their own fears, their own inability to tolerate vulnerability and need. The person who loved them didn't deserve the contempt, the cruelty, the rejection. They deserved appreciation, gratitude, reciprocal love. But the avoidant couldn't provide those things because they were too defended, too scared, too consumed by self-hatred to accept and return genuine love. This recognition that the person who loved them was hurt, not because of anything they did wrong, but because of the avoidant's own limitations, is devastating because it removes the avoidant's ability to blame the other person, forcing them to sit with responsibility for destroying something good. The recognition includes the avoidant confronting that they treated the person who loved them worse than they treated people they cared about less. The people the avoidant keeps at distance, casual relationships, friendships, acquaintances, receive better treatment than the person who loved them fully, because those relationships don't trigger the avoidant's core wounds, but the person who got close enough to truly love them received the avoidant's contempt, cruelty, and rejection precisely because they mattered most, because their love triggered all the avoidant's fears and defenses. The avoidant recognizes the tragic irony. They saved their worst behavior for the people who love them best, ensuring that genuine love can never flourish, while superficial connections remain easy and pleasant. The tragic recognition also involves the avoidant realizing they've repeated this pattern across relationships, that the person who truly loved them wasn't the first person they've destroyed through their hatred and rejection of love. The avoidant sees the thread connecting their relational history, multiple people who loved them well and whom they pushed away through contempt, cruelty, or simple inability to reciprocate. This pattern recognition is devastating because it reveals that the problem isn't finding the right person. The problem is the avoidant's own wounds that make them destroy love regardless of who offers it. The person who truly loved them was special, but they weren't the only one the avoidant has destroyed. This is simply what the avoidant does when loved fully. The recognition includes confronting that the avoidant's defensive strategies, the independence, the emotional unavailability, the contempt for people who love them, have created the exact outcome they most feared. The avoidance defenses were built to protect them from abandonment, from being hurt, from becoming vulnerable to loss. But these defenses ensured abandonment by making them impossible to truly love, ensured hurt by destroying connections that could have provided joy, ensured vulnerability to loss by preventing them from building anything secure enough to last. The avoidant protected themselves so thoroughly that they protected themselves from everything good along with everything they feared. The person who loved them could have provided the security they needed, but the avoidance defenses made receiving that security impossible. The tragic recognition also involves the avoidant understanding too late what genuine love requires. Not just receiving it, but accepting it. Not just being loved, but allowing yourself to be loved. Not just having someone offer connection, but being willing to be vulnerable enough to truly connect. The person who loved them offered everything: patience, acceptance, understanding, sustained presence despite the avoidance patterns. But the avoidant couldn't receive it because receiving would have required lowering defenses they weren't ready to release, accepting needs they couldn't tolerate having, being vulnerable in ways that felt too dangerous. The avoidant recognizes that the failure wasn't the person's inability to love them well enough. It was their own inability to accept love, regardless of how well it was offered. The tragic recognition sometimes motivates the avoidant to change, to do the deep work on their attachment wounds, to develop capacity for accepting love rather than destroying it. These avoidants use the pain of recognizing what they destroyed as fuel for transformation, committing to therapy and personal work so they won't repeat the pattern with future partners. But even with transformation, the recognition remains tragic because the specific person who loved them is gone, moved on, no longer available to benefit from the growth their loss catalyzed. Other avoidants remain stuck in the recognition without moving toward change, understanding what they destroyed, but not developing capacity to accept love differently. Repeating the pattern of pushing away anyone who gets close enough to matter, while understanding on some level the tragedy of their own patterns. The tragic recognition of what they destroyed through their hatred ultimately reveals that dismissive avoidant attachment is a form of self-sabotage disguised as self-protection, a defense strategy that destroys the very thing it's meant to preserve. The self it's protecting ends up isolated, disconnected, unable to receive the love that would actually create the security the defenses are meant to provide. The person who truly loved them wasn't an enemy, despite how the avoidant treated them. They were exactly what the avoidant needed, someone who could see them fully and love them anyway, someone patient enough to wait while they worked through fear, someone strong enough to maintain themselves while the avoidant struggled with intimacy. But the avoidant's hatred, born from their own wounds and projected onto someone who didn't deserve it, destroyed this connection, ensuring the avoidant remained alone in the fortress they built to protect themselves, a fortress that keeps them safe from hurt, but also keeps them safe from love, from connection, from everything that makes life feel meaningful, rather than simply manageable. The tragedy is that this outcome was preventable, that the person who truly loved them was offering the key to unlock the fortress. But the avoidant's hatred of being loved, their contempt for vulnerability, their resentment of being seen, their projection of self-hatred, ensured they destroy the key and remain imprisoned in defenses that protect them from nothing, except the possibility of genuine connection, growth, and the kind of love that could have transformed them if they'd been capable of accepting it, rather than hating the person brave enough to offer it.